Hello again, welcome to RP-0. So we have RP-0 America. So we've got two new astronauts here in our Gemini ready to take off. They are new. We have a pilot and a scientist, and if we go take a look, we are now a little bit behind, but we're going to do it's a fairly quick launch after the previous. Let's see. So I'll just go to locked SAS, light the engines, and let's go. So it's we have two goals with this launch that are I find to be a bit tricky to accomplish with split attention. So I might be a little quiet during this launch, and even then have a bit of trouble. But we want to reach orbit, which in and of itself is a bit tricky with a Titan II Gemini, I find. And also, we want to get this relative inclination as low as possible. Now, the lowest I ever really get it with a launch like this is half a degree, although I'm sure it's possible to get closer, particularly with a different vehicle. But with this vehicle, that's about as close as I ever seem to be able to get. So that's what I'll be shooting for. I'll be doing various random little headings adjustments, and you'll be seeing this probably wander away once in a while, but that's just kind of as good as I can manage it while doing my best to make sure that we achieve orbit, which is more important. If this is off by more than half a degree, we will still be able to rendezvous. It'll just cost a bit more RCS, whereas if we don't make orbit, we don't really have a mission at all. So that is the more important aspect. So we are approaching max Q, I think. We're still increasing in dynamic pressure, so we don't want to pitch too far off of the prograde. That's what. As long as you've got engines that can gimbal a bit, you can use smart ASS and just peg to surface velocity, and you're basically staying with a relatively small angle of attack, which is ideal. Right, it'll go to target there. So relatively soon we're going to want to pitch down there. There we go. We're below 20 kilopascal, so that's still a pretty substantial force, but the engines can gimbal a bit, and it's only a few more seconds until that sinks even more. Alright, and a sign that I've done that more or less right is I lucked out, and now we have a pretty low relative inclination, even though I wasn't watching that, and time to APO. So one disadvantage of my relatively decent install right now is we're running at full time, and so every second of launch I only have 1 second of brain time to react and compensate, so very tricky. Alright, I want to be pitched a bit below for this last little bit. No, actually not. Maybe not, just because we're only a minute from APO, and this is really not very high already, so I think this will be good. We'll probably stay at a pitch somewhat like this for most of the mission, so I'll probably just go to surface velocity. Let's see, what are we heading? 92, pitch of 15. I think that's fine, and very shortly we will be lighting the engine. Because right now we're not really very high at all for first stage burnout, but that's okay for a vehicle like this. All right, and hot stage. Second stage is ignited, up to thrust, and we've dropped the first stage. And that's why there's those little gaps in that, so that the exhaust gases from igniting the second stage engine can escape while it's getting up to thrust and before you separate. There's not too many American vehicles I'm aware of that do that hot stage, but it's very common in all the R7 Soviet vehicles, and it's fun and keeps you paying attention. Alright, so I'm not going to have, because this is a very, I don't know what the right term would be, steep or shallow ascent with this vehicle. Don't have too much of a conflict between remaining time in stage and apoapsis. So I'm actually going to pitch up a bit in order to drag this out so we end up higher. We're not going to be, because of this really aggressive gravity turn, we're not going to be quite out of the atmosphere once we actually reach our peak altitude and we finish burning out this stage. But we will have plenty of RCS to adjust that out. So now, as our thrust continues to increase, thrust stays the same, the vehicle gets lighter and lighter. The acceleration effect force means that this is starting to level off, and this continues to drop 1 second every second. And our relative inclination isn't too bad, but I could certainly make it better, so let's just adjust just a tiny bit there. Unfortunately, the way I've set up the craft, the astronauts are kind of to the side. They're not looking down or looking up. Actually, I'm not sure if anybody's a Gemini expert, whether they know at this point whether the crew would be looking down towards the ground or up towards the sky. I'm a bit curious. I would guess up towards the sky, but I don't really have sufficient reason to justify to back that guess. Alright, so how's my relative inclination doing? Yeah, it's flat. There's nothing bad about that necessarily. Half a degree I would be pretty happy with. And so now these times are getting closer and closer. We don't have too much time left before this stage burns out. So this is like one of the fastest burning to orbit American vehicle I'm aware of, where it's not too much more than 5 minutes before you get to orbit. And you could actually make vehicles in RP-0 yourself with this high of a thrust-weight ratio. It's not the most delta V efficient, but delta V efficiency isn't everything. Any stretch of the imagination. So we're still going to be skimming within the atmosphere, it looks like, once we level off, but as long as we leave ourselves with a little bit of an upward coast, so we'll skim up out of the atmosphere, we'll approach whatever our APO is, hopefully something about 300, and then we can use RCS to make a correction once we're up there. We can, pretty much losing the American coastline there. 19 seconds left in this stage, so I'm just leveling off. Relative inclination, I'm not dissatisfied with that at all. Just don't want it to start creeping up and away just during these last final seconds of burn. Alright, so I'm going to cut off when we get to about 300 there, and hopefully we're in orbit. Oh, pretty close, not too bad, and we're coasting up, so you might actually see these parameters change, because as we're still skimming through air, and just because of that, I'm going to hold on to this stage because it adds more weight. We basically have the same cross section here, and so the momentum of this is actually very, very, very slightly, kind of helping us towards orbit because the air pushes back and we're butting up against this dry stage. All right, but we are in orbit. Not too bad of an orbit either. So I might make this a short video just because I did have a weird crash. I had already brought this to orbit and then I had that really weird issue where craft just disappeared. So I might end this video relatively shortly once we've kind of leveled off, once I've kind of looked at some numbers before I jump to the other craft, because that's what caused it to give me weird behavior before when I was going to look at the numbers from the other craft's perspective. So let's see, we want docking. So these two first sections aren't going to be very meaningful information right now, and we're so far away from the other craft. So we will ignore that. And delta V pretty much does not matter at all anymore. So we can just close that. I can put that there. All right, so it's about 30-minute coast till we get to apoapsis. So let us warp ahead a bit. So we'll be crossing over the... Oh, right, we can't warp too fast, actually, I suppose. Auto time warp cancel, yeah. Because we're still inside the atmosphere. Oh, now we're out of the atmosphere, which is nice. Just in terms of general planning, I intend to complete this mission, and sometime before I send my first kind of sortie of my first rally, at least 2 launches I'm planning towards Mars, I'm going to try to install clouds, kind of do a review of mods and stuff, because this install is getting relatively old. And so I can probably get RSS-VE clouds working and tweak a couple of other things just to make things look a little nicer, etc. Alright, so we are still climbing. I'm not sure why it is slash to cancel. I think it just cancels if I hit time warp anyway. So we're not in the atmosphere anymore, I don't think. Oh, and because of that I can probably just ditch the dry stage. No real benefit of having it anymore. And so there you go, you can see the docking port we're going to use. And turn on life support equipment. Log, no, what do I want to do? Turn on RCS, there we go. I don't have it set to stage, so I found so that's the RCS I'll be using. You can see there, actually, let me just throw it up. And that's the RCS I'll be using to complete my orbit once we get to apoapsis. So just do a bit of time warp, and I can just watch that time there. So Africa should be approaching. There we are. Closest approach, actual distance. So it's getting a bit away from us still. So it's moving away. We want to be in a lower orbit than it. So we'll be adjusting the... Oops, I wandered past it while I was talking. We can see Madagascar. So we want to be in a lower orbit. Because we're behind it, a lower orbit takes slightly less time to go around the Earth. So if we're behind it, we want to be a little lower, give us a shorter period, orbital period, and so we can start catching up to it. And we also want to have at least one point in the orbit where our orbits overlap, where we can set up for a future encounter. So we want to sync things up so at that point, sometime in the future, we'll both be arriving at that same location at the same time. Within seconds, within meters or kilometers, and it'll be a couple of adjustments. So if you're the kind of person who doesn't like watching the gradual adjustments for docking and rendezvous and orbiting or for rendezvous then docking, that's what a lot of the remainder of the next video or two will be. But I find it does take a bit of time, a bit of finesse, and so I find that to be the payoff. You finally succeeded getting them to orbit. I would eventually like to make a script so I could do orbital construction, but again, in this mission, for other reasons in this series, I'm planning to go kind of a Mars direct, single launch, of various things towards Mars. So not a lot of orbital construction, orbital rendezvous required, other than for dual landing lunar missions, I'll have to do rendezvous on the surface, and for station missions like this, we have to do 2 launches that kind of end up at the same location. So first off, we do just want to get this out of the atmosphere. So we want to get this to, now it's officially out of the atmosphere, but we do have, because there is some atmospheric drag past the atmosphere. So we will continue moving up, and you'll see this, I don't know how to pronounce that, synodic, something like that, synodic period. So this tells us like how long I think it takes for, it's like how many days it would take for the total difference for us to kind of end up at the same position relative to the other craft. And so that's going to change as we end up being the higher craft. That's something like that. But that's something we'll be paying attention to a bit later. And of course, distance to target, pretty important. So we'll get to about a 200 orbit and then call it good enough. We'll get this to, I don't know, an even number in one or both of those. Because if the orbital period of both of our craft, even though they're not exactly in the same plane, they don't have the exact same orbital parameters, if we both have the same orbital period, the time it takes to travel around the Earth once and end up at the same spot, then we'll never quite be catching up to each other. We'll just kind of stay very, very slightly out of plane into very slightly different orbits. And so we want our orbits to have some notable difference, but a common spot where we'll cross through the same space that we can meet up in the future. All right, I think that's good enough for now for this craft. So we've achieved orbit. It's slightly higher than we had wanted, but that's okay for now. I might even end up lowering this to just 300. Whatever ends up making it best for rendezvous. But for now, I'm going to do a quick save and end the video here. So as the sun sets, within the next few minutes, we will be getting a sunset over the Indian Ocean, I think, as we've just passed over Africa after completing our orbit. All right, so thank you for watching RP-0 America. We've brought 2 brand new minted astronauts into orbit in our Gemini craft. Light it up a little bit more there. And shortly we will be rendezvousing and docking with our manned orbital laboratory station. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.